All right, fam, welcome back. Um, yeah, I am so excited today about our guest. This is a brother that, yeah. So I, man, you sneaky brother, because I had no idea until I start researching, preparing for this interview, who I was dealing with.
Uh-oh. You're an internet sleuth looking up all
Dude,
the research because the internet never forgets, I guess.
oh man, I mean, you just look, and I think it's one of the things that I love about probably almost every guest. Um, but you in particular, man, you're just this unassuming dude that just is moving. And I didn't realize how big you were you were moving, man. Look, so just to give everybody a little background, I met Saul. Um, man, what has it been? 5
About
years?
5 years, Steph. Yeah, 5 years.
Through a mutual friend, Betsy Butler. So thank you, Betsy, for introducing us. And we met at, what was it, LA County
Hall of
court,
Administration, our county
yep.
government in LA County. Yeah.
And we sat and had some lunch and had some conversation, and man, and I just and the relationship has grown, and he's engaged me in some work and effort in LA around juveniles, around probation. And I'm like I said, I'm blown away. So look, man. So everybody else can get a little flavor of what I just found out this morning and over the last few days. Can you give us just a little quick, summary of your background, man, and then we're gonna get into the why,
Sure.
if that's all right.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's great to be here with you, Stefan, and be part of Reason 55. I'm so excited you're launching it. I think you have such an important voice and trajectory in the world and commitment to everything that's good. So I'm glad you're using this platform to have conversations and bring folks into it. I think the easiest way to describe what I'm, been dedicating my time to is that first meeting. So we were sitting in the middle of the seat of government in the largest county of this country, which, if it was a state, LA County would be uh, the eighth largest state in the United States. And that's by virtue of our population, but also this is a county that moves $30 billion a year that are intended to serve the needs of the people of the county of LA. And let's be clear, even though the county manages everything from our taxes, if we're homeowners, the vast majority of county departments are dedicated to meeting the needs of the poorest residents. So it runs our uh, county welfare systems, it runs our foster care systems, it runs our a portion of our court systems that's in partnership with the state government. But for the most part, the county's involved in your life. This is this is the kind of thing that you're dealing with, and it means that you're really impacted by things that are invisible in terms of decisions that are made in this big gigantic building right in the middle of the city that most people in the county don't know what happens there, or that there's 30 billion, now close to $40 billion a year being allocated in their name. And so my work is really about demystifying the way that our government systems and public policy making processes work, so that everyday people can get involved and actually do democracy. And in particular, I was, legally trained. I'm a graduate of law school who was never interested really in the practice of law, in terms of going into court and saying to the judge, oh, Your Honor, this is what the law says. This is how I think you should rule. I was really curious about this question of where do laws come from? And more specifically, how do people who are poor make laws, or make laws that are on the books real for them, because we live in a country where money moves things. And so that is part of why I decided to get legal training and to use that understanding to translate laws and systems and processes. And so I discovered along the way community organizing and social movement building, and a whole landscape of efforts and people and organizations that are wake up every day to make change against a lot of odds. And so, of course, in that process, it's no coincidence I will run into a man named Stephen Walker, and the way that works, like everything else in life, is like once you let light into your own life, there's a lot of people that you're going to run into who are on a similar pathway. So that is, generally speaking, my work. And when we get into it, as you mentioned, the really interesting thing about our meeting, and I am grateful too for Betsy, is that this is a woman who, for folks who don't know, was an elected official in the state government of California briefly. And she was involved in a project that I had taken on that, I have to be honest with you, I do my work, I wear two hats. I do my work as a consultant. So I take contracts primarily, I contract with nonprofit organizations that are trying to involve residents in the lawmaking process. And they need some support from an outside person to come move some kind of initiative through, or support their staff to do that. I rarely take government contracts because I like to be free from constraints that would allow me to speak openly and clearly about what I think the problems are and how I think we should be prepared to address them. In this case, the juvenile justice advocates came to me and said, we know you've been working for many years on reforming the criminal justice system. We have been fighting to get an oversight body over the probation department in LA County. It has a close to $1 billion a year budget. Half of that, 500 million, goes to managing our probation youth camps and juvenile halls. And there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. And the county is hiring a consultant to facilitate that process. And we think that someone with your background and skills should, be in that role. And I said, the last time I was at the county building, I was with a bunch of grandmothers raising their grandkids who had been removed from their homes, largely because the parents had been incarcerated, most of them for drug addiction needs. And we were doing a protest. We had picket signs. It was just a bunch of kids under 5 because they were not old enough to be in school, and their grandparents. And the county's version of receiving us at this building was to send out a bunch of sheriff's deputies and to surround us as we were doing our picket line. So I have a lot of skepticism about whether this county can actually do meaningful civic engagement with the people that it governs. But I'm going to go down this path with you guys and learn about the juvenile justice side and do what I can to create this oversight body. And in the process, one of the participants, Betsy Butler, who was on the probation commission then, said to me, you have to meet the person that I referred to as my favorite person that I met the entire time I was in Sacramento. His name is Stephen Walker. He is the head of government relations for the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. And I looked at her and I thought, what makes you think that based on the work that I have done, organizing formerly incarcerated folks, fighting against the influence of law enforcement agencies in our politics, that I would ever have any kind of conversation to have with a man named Steph Walker. But I have learned to be open, and it was such a great decision by her to introduce us, because it has set us on this journey of opening up a new chapter in how to do this work and how to do social change work. And so I'm happy to talk with you a little bit about what that has looked like, and how folks can get involved.
Absolutely, man. That's fantastic. So look, you brought up two things that I think are near and dear to both of our hearts. Um, one is helping people understand how to exercise their rights, how to be informed. Now, I'll tell you, in my research, I didn't realize I was sitting in the company of one of the OG rebel rousers at UCLA, man. But
Yeah.
so so yeah, man, can you share just a little bit about that? How you got to that point, leading the I don't want to mischaracterize it, but the Chicano Latino students during that
Mhm.
time, man. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. I just want to say that I think that, like all of us, there are people who we will never know that laid seeds for us to be able to become who we are. And part of my trajectory as an activist is really built on a bunch of generations of student activists that preceded me at UCLA. And I want to share a story with you because somebody recently asked me, one of the other hats I wear besides consulting is as an educator. Our beloved poet Maya Angelou used to say, if you know how to read, that means you had a teacher. If you know how to add, that means you had a teacher, and you have an obligation to teach. And so whenever I can, I do try to be of service in that role. And I've been lucky to be able to do that at UCLA, where I was a student. But somebody asked me, like, what was my pathway there? And I have to tell you, I grew up really poor in a neighborhood that, you know, my brothers got involved with the local gang. They were older than me. I think I was protected a little bit by the fact that they were, and you know, UCLA had an outreach program to communities like ours that didn't send a lot of young people to college. And so my older siblings got invited to a trip my very first time there, and that did not go well. It was just not a thing that folks were ready to hear. But by the time I was in high school, or at some point in my trajectory, I was able to go back to UCLA, and it was right in the middle of the anti-apartheid student movement that was trying to convince the UC system to divest its pension plan from any companies that were invested in South Africa. I didn't know anything about pensions. I didn't know about divestment campaigns. What I did see when I got to the campus was that the students had created a Mandela village and were sleeping in the middle of the campus next to this famous statue of a Bruin bear and across from the bookstore. And I was just riveted. I could not believe that there was these young people who were there, compelled enough to, spend nights there, make these demands, have picket signs. And it just marked me. I'm like, oh, this is why you get a college education. This is why you go to college, to get the skills to change the world and to speak up and to disrupt business as usual when the structures that move society are so deeply invested in the status quo. And I may not have had the words for that at the time, but that deeply impacted me. And so by the time I got there in the late 80s, deep in the throes of the Reagan administration and the rollback of the civil rights movement's gains, I thought that's what we were there to do. Um, And there was other activist produced programs that helped me. I was tutored by folks in a program for first generation students and students of color, marginalized students, low income students. And so then I became a tutor my second year. And my first year, I was clear that I came from a high school that underprepared me. And I couldn't get into the protesting right away. I needed to really learn how to be a good college student. And I was grateful for that advice and for the support to be able to learn how to be a good college student. But I really want to be a good college student activist. That's what I want to do. And so in my second year, I joined the Chicano Latino Student News Magazine. And I started writing stories that I would be assigned about issues in the community, issues on campus that related to the types of obstacles that our people had overcome just to be college students and the ones that remained. And in that space, we were sharing space with all of the other 6 student magazines that existed at the time, including the Black student magazine NOMO. Folks like Ava DuVernay were there at that time as a student, also writing for magazines like NOMO. Um, it just shaped me to be in a cross-racial, cross socially oppressed groups. We had a gay student publication at a time where it was a big deal that the school offered its first gay and lesbian studies class, and people who were taking it weren't sure if they wanted it on their transcript because of the level of discrimination. This was the don't ask, don't tell era. We had a Jewish student magazine, we had magazines that didn't exist yet. So when the Muslim students went to create one, the school told them there was not enough space to have a 7th magazine. And so we in the Chicano publication said, oh, we'll give them half of our space. And so it was this sort of cross group unity building and really feeling what solidarity looked like and how you have to stand together when you're doing social change work, because if you're doing social change work, you're making people uncomfortable, and you need to have a crew of folks that hold you accountable, keep you in the right direction, but also stand with you when you're going to be withstanding attacks.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was just to answer your question, like the reason that I became editor of that publication. And in 1993, when I was graduating, we had a major leader die, Cesar Chavez, who had formed the Farm Worker Union with Dolores Huerta, who is still around in her 90s, going to protest up until she was in her 80s. And it was in that moment that the school said that Chicano Studies did not merit departmental status, and that we would not have our own department, that this would continue to just be a program with a list of classes that could be taken across different existing departments. And so that led to a hunger strike that I was in a position to cover as editor of our paper. I was now a senior, and I was able to write some pieces for the outside audience who was like, what's happening at UCLA, and why are the Mexican and Latino students, protesting and people getting arrested? And so that's probably what you came across, but it was a formative moment for me in understanding how power works and how collectivizing ourselves in face of the structures of power can make differences. I came back 10 years later to teach in that department that we eventually won. And I taught a class called Latinos and the Law that introduced other students that the law is not just what's on the books or what happens in the courts. It's, of course, what we fight for and what we make real through our actions day to day. So I appreciate you asking about that, because it was one of the highlights, like everybody should have in your early 20s, to be shaped in a college campus.
Wow, man. Okay, so the other component. Well, thank you for that, Saul, because like I said, I read it and was like, how do I not know this about this guy? But looking at the way you move, I mean, it absolutely makes sense that the like the point you pointed out about us meeting is there's this willingness to 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 not be afraid to potentially disagree, but to be bold enough to want to engage in the conversation and be open enough to say, let's talk. Let's see where, where we might be able to go. And I'll tell you from the class, yeah, did you guys put together? I, I'm I, I'm that's another living example of bringing people together and having a conversation. Um, so I have another question for you, based loosely on that, is your foster care. You mentioned that earlier, the foster grandparents. Um, what leads you? What motivates you to engage in that work of keeping families together? I mean, that's probably a very boiled down perspective of it, but that's what it feels like, is keeping families together.
That's
And
exactly it. And that's the right question around why I ended up in my organizing trajectory in terms of learning community organizing, in terms of learning public policy, community-based public policy making. Um, what what explains why one of the very first campaigns that I did was called Family Care, Not Foster Care. The one that we were fighting with these grandmothers was simply to point out a basic fact, which was that in LA County, of the 40,000 or so children who had been removed from their homes as a result of the policies implemented after the war on drugs, 60% of them were being raised by grandmothers, because the law does create a preference that children who are removed by the state first get to be placed with any willing family member. And these were largely poor Black and Brown women in South LA, what we call Service Planning Area 6. And we created all these maps showing that 60% were with grandmothers and 40% fully of all of that caseload was in South LA, with these Black and Brown folks. The smallest number was in group homes. But if you took the $1 billion budget of the foster care system in that time, 1999, it was the exact opposite. The vast majority of money, more than 60%, was going to pay for the egregious cost of having children who had failed out of being cared for in the home, been failed by the system that wouldn't give any of the grandmothers the assistance at the front end. And then once, lo and behold, the child that didn't get tutoring, it didn't get all of that, they didn't get all of the things that you would need to prevent them from going into a group home as a troubled teenager. All of a sudden, there was now money to pay for very expensive counselors and lodging and everything else that the group homes would charge the county. So it was a classic mismatch between where the need and the vast majority of everyday people were trying to hold families together without any state aid, and in fact, in many ways, being at being facing a lot of state bullying. I don't know what else to describe it, because I actually went through this when one of my uncles died. My mother's brother. I was just out of law school. His wife, uh, treated her pain with drugs and alcohol, and my two cousins at the time, 13 and 15, were now dealing with having lost their father and their mother's ability to care for them. And the older boy came to stay with my mother, and I happened to have gone to Central America to do human rights work after law school. I came back for Christmas holiday, and there was a knock on the door, and my mother answered it. I was in the bedroom listening to the conversation, and Spanish speaking Latina, like my mother, a social worker, at the door, essentially interrogated my mother for taking in her nephew, and accusing her and saying, you know, we can remove the other children who live in this house if you do not meet the county requirements for how you're living. We're going to need to send somebody here to remove this child, and there will be a court hearing, and you'll have to come and establish that you're fit to have him here. And you know, my mother was just that, you know, I lost my brother, and I don't want to lose my nephew to the system, and their mother's not able to care for them. So I was in that moment reminded, right, that, you know, as a Chicano, I didn't need to go all the way to Central America to find a human rights violation. It was happening right at the door of this house that my mom was trying to do this work in. And so I, you know, tried to dialogue with the social worker and just, you know, realized like she was trained a certain way. She had assumptions about us because, you know, of the poverty level in that household or whatever. Anyway, I didn't go back to Central America. I stayed. I became a relative caregiver on paper with my mom. My mom, of course, did most of the caregiving, and he was a teenage boy, so he and I obviously had a point of connection. And I was able to provide some level of mentorship and all that. But it was really going through that process and walking in the shoes of the families that get put through. And I did used to use this phrase that you just mentioned. I used to call it the family destruction machine of the foster care system, the juvenile system, and the criminal justice system. Was what I observed. We're working together to, as you say, really break up families, communities, neighborhoods, and really threatening the well-being of poor Black and Brown families and other families that get caught up in the system in other communities that look differently, but where a lot of the same factors exist. So for me, that's the through line between why I would be working with a bunch of grandmothers in the late 90s. And then, as you referenced, just this last January to June, being able to convene folks like yourself who are people with experience working in the juvenile system, as correctional youth officers, and people who had been incarcerated in those same correctional systems as young people during that same time period. While I was doing the work on the family side, you all were watching the transformation of our youth system into what it became, which is, you know, the extreme version of it is people refer to them as gladiator schools. And at here, as we stand here, there's a date to shut down the state youth correctional system in July of 2023. That would be a huge victory, so that we can, you know, begin to build something different. And the inquiry that came up for me to create a container where folks with your work experience and commitment to justice could also be in conversation with folks who had been locked up as young people and guide that transition from the existing and past system that we have into whatever we're going to build next. It was really informed by my experience and my learning that the hardest conversations are the ones that produce the I think the most unique wisdom and observation. And so I came up with this idea that if we could put folks into a process together where they could hear each other's perspectives on these key questions. How should we be dealing with childhood trauma? How do we transition from the existing system? What would need to be put in place so that we can acknowledge the harms of the existing system, not just on the people who were incarcerated, but the people who work there? What could that do to help us not repeat the mistake of building a new system? It always gets built with a good intention, and people say this is going to be the new thing and it's going to be different. But nobody ever does this, is put the human beings who actually were in the middle of the existing thing that wants to be changed in the driver's seat to change it. And so that's what that class was intended to do. And I was really glad that you were able to participate and that we were able to build a community of folks that were willing to say, yeah, what we have something to say, and we don't normally get to talk to each other across our experience on both sides of these cells. Let's talk to each other and see where this can go as California and LA County are trying to shift into a new justice system.
Wow. Yeah, Saul, I'm truly thankful for that opportunity, man. It's I think that we met about the middle of my education, awakening, whatever you want to call it, about the fact that the system was hurting people and hurting people across the board. Um, and then the opportunity to sit and actively engage with young people, and then to meet a guy that actually done.
That was golden. That was golden. And what he said, if you remember, we're referring to our brother Gonzalo, who is in this course and now works at an amazing organization called Homeboy Industries, but came into the course on his own, and you know, has been, like Stefan, such a light in terms of how we do this, right? Somebody who I'd never met before the course comes into it, his heart is wide open, his mind is completely sharp and agile around the questions on the table, and then chooses to have the courage to open up and build rapport with somebody like you, who was a correctional youth officer in one of the facilities he was in, and goes on this journey and is now building on that. We can share something before we wrap up on where things are going to go next. But what I remember him saying is the reason he remembered that you were in one of the facilities he had been detained in as a young person was your laugh. And that laugh would never leave his mind. And so I think, like the rest of us who were around you, it's a contagious laugh. It was just great to hear him describe what all of us feel when we hear you come in the room.
Well, look, so I think the one thing that as we've been talking is number one, the value of human connection, of having these conversations and realizing that despite the surface and no matter how turbulent it is, that at our base we're all human beings, and we all have, we're all trying to live. We want to not just survive. And I think that's part of the problem with the correctional system is and criminal justice system is that humanity gets suppressed, and it's about a system. Like that caseworker that came to the door, she was trained to execute a process as opposed to looking at serving humanity, serving family, serving the community. And that's one of the things, man. I look at you, and now after having done this research, I'm like, this dude is about it. He is about the community. He is about humanity. He's about caring that our systems are broken. and I know my producer will kill me if I don't ask this of you. How can people, how can organizations engage with you to support and move our society forward, that it continues to evolve? How can they be there to support you? Because look, man, I'm there. I'm there. I'm gonna be there. I'm riding with you. But how can other people, how can other entities be there to connect and support what you're doing?
No, I appreciate the question. I think that you know, beyond supporting, me and my efforts, I think it's, how do we support what you started with, which is centering human connection and human beings in the way that systems and institutions work. And I would say that the most important thing I think people can do is identify the systems and institutions that directly touch your life, the life of your family members, and to think about ways in which they can walk towards the mechanisms that exist to be able to shape them. And if they don't exist, how you might find other people who are impacted by them so that you can collectivize your ability to impact them. Now, I don't have any kids in the school system. I live across the street from a high school. And I first moved here, I was like, "Ooh, there's the track right across the way. I want to, go run there every day." And it's like, well, there's a big fence, and the school doesn't really see itself as related to the neighbors. So, if you have kids in there, you could go in there and have a stake. And if you don't, even if you pay taxes, you ain't gonna have a stake, and you can't use this track. So, I think it might be a decision as simple as that. What's an institution that I live near? If your children are impacted by the decisions being made at the board level, um, these are not sexy things to spend your time on. But I also feel like I want to encourage people to think about how to rupture the way that these things normally happen. Unfortunately, we see the example of that on the other side, which is about dividing people and deploying folks into board meetings and saying you can't teach anything about the racial history of this country, or we're going to come after you with pitchforks. We see that happening. And so in the face of that, it becomes even more courageous to be able to be the level-headed person in the room and to sit there with your clear principles and to say, I'm not going to be erased from this process. And I also, I'm not going to be bullied into silence or submission. I am going to walk towards anybody who's willing to be in it for the long run and who's willing to be in it from a process where we will be disagreeing with each other on things. And if we want our democratic institutions to survive, we have to learn how to disagree with each other as we're contending with the hard questions around how we want things to be. So right now on the juvenile justice transformation, there is a similar process that is open to anybody who would like to participate in LA County and even outside of LA County. You're not down here in Southern California, and you've been able to really make an impact on that process because the experience that you have is directly germane with around the human beings that are being transferred to our county detention systems from the state detention systems, and who we are hoping, will be liberated from that, because we do feel like there are different ways that we can handle the needs of folks who are young and who have made mistakes in their lives and who need a different kind of pathway than the one we've currently used, and produces nothing but 70% rate of people graduating from the juvenile system into the adult prison system. So all that being said, we have a youth justice advisory group that meets monthly here in LA County, and that is basically charged with bringing in any stakeholder, that's the language the county uses, basically any human being who's interested in how our current system treats young people who have been, who are involved in the courts, they've been charged with a crime, they've been, they're either being adjudicated if they're in a juvenile hall while their case is being heard, and there are conditions in the juvenile hall that should matter to all of us. And if they are released from that juvenile hall into a camp for a sustained period of time, that is also part of this juvenile system. And the question is, what do we want our taxpayer money to be paying for, to be happening in these spaces that could produce a better outcome than the one that we have? Certainly, people who have been formerly incarcerated or young people should be at the head of that table with other people who are directly impacted by that system. I would say workers in those systems are also directly impacted by the conditions that they are being sent in to work in. And that's why I have worked to elevate the voice of people like you and to bring them into that conversation with those young people. And lo and behold, what do we see? That these folks are able to say some of the same things that they see that should be different. And it's produced a different kind of conversation. And so I'm really grateful for you to be in that space. Anybody who has an interest in the work of the Youth Justice Advisory Group for LA County can reach out to our wonderful host here, and he can put you in touch with me, and I'll make sure that you have the schedule for how to do that. But that's the main thing we're working on right now here in LA County that I would invite folks to be a part of that are interested.
All right. And trust me, it is a worthwhile effort. There's some, as the saying goes, some come to Jesus moments in that, but at the same time, I feel that anyone that has seen this system firsthand, well, in any capacity, whether that's someone coming in to visit, someone working there, someone that's been adjudicated there, you have an opinion and a perception that is absolutely valuable in establishing a better system, a better way to care for people. With that, Saul, that's why I salute you, man, is for these things have just been on autopilot for decades. And there have been people that have suffered, traumatized, even died from it. And the system goes on because we're silent about it. I think it's Neil Hurston's comment or quote of they will, if you're silent about your suffering, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. So yeah, it's time for us to come together, the voices of the people impacted by these systems, to come together and speak out and talk about it. We're going to find out we have a common interest of a better society, a better systems that support that society. And so, man, brother, hats off to you, because you are doing God's work, brother. You really are, and I thank you for it.
Hey, that's off to you. Thanks for getting involved the way that you have, and bringing that laugh and your smile into the entire process. I want to thank you because I have to say that in my own trajectory, particularly as somebody who has been impacted by, I just this weekend went to visit my brother who's deported, raised with me since he was 1, but deported under a 1996 law that allows people with drug-related felonies to be deported, no matter how long they've been here, no matter how many U.S. citizen kids they have. Also somebody who's lost a brother who, after going through several stints in the incarceration system, and a sister with a long history of different ways of self-medicating through a lot of the challenges that poor folks go through. Even with all of that, I had never come to appreciate and ask myself the question, what does it look like to work in these systems? And it was my meeting you, and learning that your father had also been, a correctional youth, probably at the time what was called a youth group supervisor. I learned from you before it became a correctional youth officer position. Learning about his reputation and the work that he did in a time where folks who went into that kind of work could, see the young people as human beings and take them to the movies, take them to the beach. It just a different kind of context than the one that we've grown up in. Um, uh, Learning about the work that your son was doing, and about his tragic death, which to this day I'm just always feeling for you, but also learning about how your family history as three generations of Black men who found work in a system that was where the state put money to deal with young Black men and brown men and others who what the state needed was to resource us to support those young people, like our family members who we've lost, and others in a different way that didn't diminish anybody's humanity who was on both sides of the juvenile cells. And imagine what it would mean to get rid of those cells and to deal with our impulse to want to help each other find a different pathway in a different context. It's not easy work. It comes with a personal price, as we think about the hard moments, but it also comes with a different kind of reward in terms of doing it from a perspective where we have human beings that we're connected to that are impacted in these ways. But whether it's because of that, or because you care about where your taxpayer money goes, because you care about not creating systems that bring darkness into a worker's life or brings darkness into a child's life, all of those are compelling enough reasons for us to care enough to learn what is the vocabulary that the people in power use to justify what we currently have in place, and how to just keep chipping away at it, because that's how social change happens. But the thing that sustains us through various phases of it is keeping our hearts and our minds open to learning from each other and centering the people in the middle of it, even though we have to learn the language of policy and systems and all of these mechanisms. To me, that's been the most rewarding thing. It's why I'm so happy to be in conversation with you. And I know that, whatever we build along the way, whatever we do and achieve, is going to be secondary to how deep into relationship we want to go into with each other. Because once human beings get there, nothing's going to stop us from producing the change that we need to produce.
There you go, brother. Amen.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we actually caught that on tape, Sal, because that needs to be immortalized, brother.
We're doing it. We're doing it through our actions more than anything. But I'm glad that you have taken a pause. I mean, your life itself, I mean, and everything that you've gotten involved with is right along this journey, right along this path. And I think we don't always give ourselves the privilege of reflecting and having a conversation around what we're seeing and what we're doing together. I mentioned earlier that I think it's worthwhile to note, what's come out of this latest phase of the work, and that is that I will be seeing you in person in a few weeks in the context of bringing in somebody, bringing in the person we mentioned earlier, Gonzalo, formerly incarcerated young man who remembers Stefan's laugh from when he was working in one of the detention centers, and has chosen, outside of the context of a formal class and just through his interest as a human being, to walk towards Stefan and other folks who have been working in these systems and begin to build the seeds for a truth, healing, and reconciliation process for what California's youth justice system has been, what it is and how the human beings who've been touched by it can be instrumental to creating models of walking towards each other, building dialogue with each other, and naming with each other what went wrong, what could be different, and how they can stand together in making sure that the state transitions into something that looks more like real justice for all of the human beings involved. So I thank both of you for including me in that work, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks so we can begin building it.
Hey, so I'm looking forward to it as well, brother. I want to thank you today for being with us and you know lifting your voice in the community, brother, in LA, in the US, and in Reason 55, man.
Right
Thank
on.
you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So with that, we're gonna close. Well, we're never gonna end the conversation. We're just gonna take a pause and
Pause
and
button.
so at some point, I hope you're willing to come back, brother, so we can get a little deeper into what's going on and prayerfully, I'm not being overly optimistic here in saying that Mayor Bass will have been actively engaged and we're having some things go on down there. And at some point, actually, I'd like you to meet the mayor up here, Mayor Steinberg. And so
Yeah,
that we can,
hats off to the people who decide to be on the other side of this work. We agitate from the outside, and then there are people who take on the challenge of governing. And sometimes it frustrates us what they have to do in terms of their decision-making processes. But the reference to Karen Bass, who's the person that taught me community organizing, who gave me the space to shape the first campaigns, and said to me, like, everything I learned about what the foster care families are going through, I learned it through the memos you would have to write up when she formed the nonprofit organization where I went to do this work after law school. We're hoping that she can be of service now as mayor of the city. In a couple months, we'll know. In a month, we'll know whether she wins the election. But the reference to her as an organizer that moved into governance, I think, is a really instructive one. There are things about politics I don't have any interest in policymaking. I used to tell some of my students, if you want to go into the cesspool of City Hall, I never worked inside of a City Hall. I've never worked as a decision maker, but I do work on the outside. But it is important for people to be inside of these systems who are change agents and know how to center human beings. I would reference chapter 21 of a book called Becoming Miss Burton, which is where the description by a formerly incarcerated woman of the foster care campaign happens. She happened to come to our organization and is now a leader in her own right in the movement by formerly incarcerated people to change laws that discriminate against them. And I just want to share in closing how moved I was when I first met you, Stefan. We're having lunch in this building, and I'm realizing that the first line of that chapter where Susan is describing meeting me is a meeting where I laid out some statistics about the influence of the CCPOA on our state legislature and our governor's races in the 80s and 90s. And I said, this is why you kept going back to prison as somebody whose son, who was a 5-year-old boy that was run over and killed by an off-duty police officer and medicated, became addicted, and nobody ever stopped to say, what's the underlying trauma? Because I felt that the influence the influence of the money that the CCPOA had put into our lawmaking process had almost guaranteed that someone like Susan would never get treatment, but would constantly get incarcerated. And I remember sharing with you, after you told me the story about your family trajectory in the system, that I said, I want you to read this chapter, and ahead of you doing that. I want to apologize for erasing the possibility that anyone like your father could exist within the CCPOA, that anyone like you could exist in the CCPOA. And it's such a reminder of something that Karen Bass taught me, which is that, you have to create the way to find and join the change makers, especially in places where you don't think that they are. And every time we did a campaign targeting a county department, her first requirement was, did you go meet with the union of the workers? I was like, but the workers are the ones that are, doing this thing to the members in our house, the grandmothers. And then we had a people on welfare group that we were organizing. And she just was very clear, the community and workers need to be on the same side. And when they're not, the way to get there is to talk to each other. And it is your job to go and take that first step. And so I'm grateful to her that something that I do very easily as an individual, I could also learn to do in my work on the policy side. And, I'm happy to be on my volunteer hat on weekends, knocking on doors for her here in LA in hopes that she will be our next mayor and bring that same kind of commitment to policymaking to deal with serious issues like homelessness facing us down here.
Absolutely, man. From your lips to God's ears, brother. Hey, well, Saul, thank you again today, brother, for being here, and hope that we continue our conversation some point down the road. But for today, yeah, my wife is calling.
All right, thank you. I'm Saul Sarabia from Solidarity Consulting. You're listening to Reason 55 with Steph B.
Media.